On September 28th, the year 1709, near the village of Lesnaya, there was a battle that played an important role in the Northern War. 40 kilometers from Mogilev, at the river Lesnyanka, 20,000 Russian corps, under the command of Peter the Great, caught up with a large Swedish convoy, guarded by 13,000 troops. The wagons, loaded with gunpowder and provisions, were moving toward the main Swedish army, which was in dire need of supplies. In the morning, September 28th, the Russian corps was 12 kilometers from the enemy. At 5:45, Peter ordered the regiments to act. The soldiers, built in columns, moved forward on two narrow roads, laid in the swampy, wooded area. The Russian troops were commanded by experienced generals. The eastern column was led by Prince Menshikov, Peter's closest associate and friend since his youth, a brilliant cavalry commander who took part in many battles. The western column was commanded by Tsar Peter. The cavalry was led by Lieutenant General Bohr, who by this time had time to gain experience in the armies of other European countries, including Swedish. The Guards Brigade was led by Golitsyn, who began his service in the Poteshny at the age of 10 years. The Swedish detachment was commanded by General Levengout, an experienced officer who had won a number of victories over Russian troops in the past. The cavalry was led by Anders Wennerstedt, commander of the Uppland Dragoon Regiment. The morale and training of the opposing units were at approximately the same level. Sweden, at that time, had one of the best armies in the world, the soldiers of Charles XII, characterized by bravery, discipline, and excellent training. Led by well-trained officers, the Swedish army swept away from the battlefield of any enemy, regardless of its size. The newly created Russian army of the new system, undoubtedly inferior to its experienced vis-à-vis, Peter, well aware of this, gathered the best parts. The core of the corps was the Guards Brigade, which included the famous Semyonovsky and Preobrazhensky regiments, which distinguished themselves at the beginning of the war in the catastrophic, for the Russians, the Battle of Narva, where the Guards managed to withstand the fierce onslaught of the Swedes and retreat with unfurled banners, keeping order. The battlefield was a forested, swampy plain. Behind the village of Lesnaya flowed a small river, Lesnyanka, over which there was a wooden bridge. From the bridge, through a dense forest, ran a dirt road to Propoysk. In front of the village there was a field, 1 kilometer wide. In the northwest lay a second field, separated from the first by a small forest. Frequent autumn rains watered the ground abundantly, turning the roads into a difficult-to-pass mess. The air was unusually cool for this time. The temperature dropped to almost zero. The Swedish train was in disorder near the village of Lesnaya. Most of the units were on the field in front of the river. The cavalry stood to the east. The rearguard, commanded by Colonel von Freiberg, consisting of 3 infantry battalions, was in the woods. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Levenhaupt gave the order to the vanguard, with the stock, move on to Propoysk. From the main detachment separated about 3,000 soldiers and a large number of carts. The Swedes refused civilian drivers, and to manage the carts had to allocate 1,500 soldiers from the regiments. Another 500 soldiers guarded a huge herd of cattle and carts. At noon, the Nevsky Dragoon Regiment, under the command of Colonel Campbell, marching at the head of the column, spotted the Swedish rearguard in the woods. No one had bothered to send out a reconnaissance, so the encounter was unexpected for both sides. The dragoons dismounted and moved forward to cover the deployment of the infantry regiments behind them. The Swedes, following the usual manner of fighting, rushed to the attack. 3 battalions of infantry, totaling 1,000 bayonets, came upon the 500 dragoons. Campbell, with all his might, tried to hold back the furious onslaught of twice superior enemy. At a cost to the Russians, managed to gain the time necessary for the infantry to deploy. The Nevsky Dragoon Regiment lost 50% of its personnel. Soon, the Ingermanland Regiment came to Campbell's rescue, and 5 battalions also came to von Freiberg. But the Swedish reserves came under the flank attack of the Guards Brigade. Hardened in battle and perfectly trained, Semyonovцы and Preobrazhenцы well coordinated. Accurate volleys mowed down the left flank of the enemy. In one of the Swedish regiments killed almost all the personnel. The stunned enemy rushed to escape, leaving 2 cannons and 8 banners. In the afternoon, the Russian regiments approached the village of Lesnaya. By this time, the Swedes had built from carts Wagenburg, a kind of defensive line, and deployed battalions in combat order. 14 3-pounder guns were placed in front, infantry lined up behind the artillery, and cavalry covered the flanks. By this time, the cavalry regiment and 2 battalions of infantry, which had gone toward Propoysk, had returned to the main body. The column, sent in the morning, could not go far. Noticing small detachments of Cossacks and Kalmyks prowling in the woods, the vanguard commander decided that ahead are large forces of the Russians and took the defense, not daring to move on. By 13 o'clock, Peter's corps numbered approximately 10,500 people, part of the forces left to protect the wagon and horses. To the annoyance of the Russian command, the Dragoon division of Lieutenant General Bora, numbering 5,000 bayonets, still had not approached the battlefield. The Russians lined up in 2 lines. In the first, in the center, were the infantry. On the flanks, the cavalry. In the second line, dragoon regiments and grenadier companies. In front, on the edge of a copse of woods, 33-pounder and 2-pounder guns were placed. Levenhaupt, by this hour, had about 9,000 men in the positions at Lesnaya. At 1 o'clock, the main battle began. Swedish soldiers were trained to conduct an aggressive offensive battle. Battalions approached the enemy at 25 meters, doubled the ranks and gave a volley. Then the soldiers moved another 10 meters, again fired, and then rushed into the bayonet. The Russians, in response to the Swedish tactics of aggressive bayonet attack, developed their own way of fighting. As soon as the Swedes began to move forward, the first line would move back. Then the second one would fire a volley at the enemy, after which cavalry would move in the gaps between the infantry battalions, forcing the Swedish infantry to prepare for defense and disrupting the offensive rush. In the heat of battle, the sides made tactical mistakes. On the flanks of the Russian dragoons, several times broke through to Wagenburg. But the commanders failed to maintain control of the cavalry and developed success by hitting the Swedish infantry in the rear. As a result, the enemy cavalry threw the Russian to the forest, where the dragoons regrouped and then attacked again. The sides rarely engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The Russians managed to impose the Swedes' distance combat at 20-30 meters. The guards that day shot 100 rounds per man. Having equal forces, the sides fought hard. At times, the Russians were thrown back to the woods. Then, supported by artillery, they again rushed to the attack, driving the Swedes back. In total, according to Peter's recollection, there were 10 attacks and counterattacks. Cavalry on the flanks acted at odds and did not support the infantry in time. Communication with the high command was also partially disrupted because the generals did not notify the officers of their position in the battle. The infantry captured Swedish guns several times, but no one realized to allocate a detachment to disable them. Tsar Peter took an active part in the battle. all the time appearing in the most dangerous areas, and once even led an attack of dragoons. At 3 o'clock, the Russians were able to push the Swedes closer to the Wagenburg, capturing 4 cannons. The battle was suspended. The exhausted soldiers sank to the ground 200 meters apart. At about 4 o'clock, Bauer's division approached, increasing the Russian troops by 5,000 broadswords. Because of the swamp and dense forest, the dragoons had to pass in dangerous proximity to the Swedish guns, which opened an accurate fire, causing significant losses to the Russian cavalry. The dragoons split up and took up positions on the flanks. The battle resumed. Levenhaupt's detachment gradually rolled back. At 5 o'clock, to the Swedes came Björnborg Infantry Regiment, numbering 800 men. However, reinforcements did not have a serious impact on the course of the battle. The Russian guards and dragoons soon seized the bridge, cutting off the Swedes' road to retreat. A small detachment of cavalry and infantry was pushed back from the main forces and pressed to the river. It seemed the defeat of Levenhaupt's corps was imminent. The Swedish units hesitated. A few soldiers in panic rushed into the river and swam to the other side. Fortunately for the Swedes, at 6 p.m. to the bridge approached 800 men. In the heat of battle, the Russians forgot or simply did not have time to leave units to defend the bridge. Fresh Swedish companies crossed the bridge unhindered and struck from the rear. The Russians, stunned by the sudden attack, retreated. Soon dusk descending on the battlefield forced the parties to stop fighting. The Russian generals took the regiments 200 meters back and put forward artillery. The guns opened fire and for 2 hours shot Wagenburg, inflicting sensitive losses on the Swedes. At night, Levenhaupt decided to retreat. The Swedes lit fires to mislead the Russians. It was decided to leave some of the carts behind, taking only the wagons with treasury and gunpowder. Wounded, unable to move, also decided to leave in the camp. The Swedes excellently organized the retreat. The tired soldiers, in full order, passed over the bridge and moved to Propoisk. The march in the dark along the muddy road finally exhausted the men, who had just endured hours of hard fighting. The wagons often got stuck in the mud, and the exhausted soldiers had to make incredible efforts to keep the column moving. Some wagons decided to destroy. In one of them, there was a supply of vodka, which the tired soldiers immediately consumed. Discipline in the column began to fall rapidly. Levenhaupt, realizing that the officers were losing control over the soldiers, ordered to break all the wagons, people to put on the freed horses and fast march to Propoisk. Massive looting began. Levenhaupt later recalled,
"In the darkness, the wagons were driving so close to each other and in such a mess that the axles broke and the whole passage was so clogged that it was impossible to go on. We harnessed the horses and took them with us. And what was in the wagons, we messed up as much as we could. The worst of it was that the regular soldiers and cavalrymen pounced on the wagons of wine and vodka during the night and overdrank themselves. Neither commands nor blows helped anymore, and about 1,000 men scattered and collapsed in different parts of the forest and fell into enemy hands the next day."
Later, Levenhaupt succeeded in gathering 6,500 men. With this detachment, without provisions and ammunition, he joined the army of Charles XII. 1,500 Swedes managed to escape to the Baltic. The defeat of Levenhaupt's corps at Lesnaya had a serious impact on the Battle of Poltava, where the Swedish king, with an army weakened by malnutrition and lack of ammunition, was forced to attack a superior enemy who had taken good defensive positions.